North Texas was just the open prairie before the Europeans got here.
Collin County was basically formed and established and molded by agricultural and economic history.
McKinney was settled by fine old pioneers, and their genes still run in the blood of their descendants.
I'd often wondered why somebody like J.B. Wilmoth or Collin McKinney come to a place where there's nobody. When Collin come here, his nearest neighbor was Natchitoches.
The first settlers came to this area when it was opened in 1843, and they established a little trading post 3 miles west of McKinney on 380 called Buckner. And then the newly formed Texas legislature passed an ordinance or law. They said that every county seat has to be within 3 miles of the center of the county. Well, Buckner wasn't.
There was quite a bit of controversy about that because the people felt that Buckner should be the county seat. But the county judge and the commissioners decided that there should be a city at the center of the county.
One of the reasons was that the circuit riding judges could ride from the center of one county to the center of another county, which is about 30 miles, in a day.
The legislature has set it up that the county seat should be on donated land if at all possible. So someone offered to donate I think it was a person named Sloan on the south of Wilson Creek. And William Davis had offered property which is north of Wilson Creek.
The people in Collin County had to vote as to where they were going to put the new seat of county government.
And it rained for a solid week, and all the creeks got out of bounds, Wilson Creek and East Fork.
My great-grandfather Ashlock was on the committee to decide the new site, and he couldn't come to vote because Wilson Creek was flooded, so was most of his farm, so he wasn't able to get to town to vote.
Nobody to the south or east could get to the polls to vote, so McKinney site won. They moved the city of Buckner up to the new site. Everybody thought, well, we'll call it Buckner like the town was. But the legislature named it for us. They said, no, Collin McKinney is an important man in your area, so they named the county Collin and the town McKinney.
Collin McKinney come to North Texas. He is my great-great-grandfather. He come here in 1843, whenever it was Mexico. He guided 11 wagon trains of people into North Texas and helped them get settled, and paperwork and everything was necessary for that time.
He had been a representative to the Constitutional Convention.
He's one of the 6 people that drafted the Texas Declaration of Independence.
He introduced a bill that all the counties, as they made them in North Texas, would be 30 miles square, as near as possible, with all the lines straight. Instead of following rivers and things, it'd be straight.
He was an illustrious citizen. I mean, just a guiding light all the way. The first building was the little store that belonged to John L. Lovejoy out at Buckner. And when they decided that we had to have a new town, why, Mr. Lovejoy hired 2 men, and they took 16 yoke of oxen and hooked it onto his little store and dragged it across the prairie and set it up on the northeast side of the square, and that was the first thing. May 3rd, 1848, so that's our birthday.
The rest of the square in this area was just thicket. Brambles and small trees and all this kind of thing. It wasn't park-like at all. The second building was supposed to have been our house saloon, which was built across the street. And from then on, the frame buildings were set up. By 1883, there were quite a few brick buildings on the west side and north side, but the east side was still all frame.
Of course, when they came, created the square, they named the streets from the states they'd come from, and then they started naming them for people who helped found the town, like Burris Street, for the old cotton mill down here, Burris Mill.
For the vast majority of people, life was farm life. And so that meant getting up early in the morning, that meant doing chores when you were a little kid, like 2 or 3 or 4 years old, and it was a long, tough, hard life out on the farm. Certainly in McKinney, there were a whole host of economic institutions that catered to the agricultural industry. So all those general stores that provided things for the farms. You came to McKinney to buy your implements, to buy your seed, to buy everything that you needed on the farm.
The reason cotton didn't take hold until after the Civil War in this area was because they didn't have a way to transport it efficiently. The nearest market was Jefferson, which was 150 miles to the east. Now, a cotton bale weighs 750 pounds. It's not real economically viable to transport cotton to Jefferson, so it was sustenance farming and ranching.
There's not a lot of trade because it's really expensive to get stuff out of here. One of the other families, and they're all intermarried, is the Wilmoth family. Very early family coming to Collin County and settling in McKinney, of course, because that's the county seat.
J.B. Wilmoth hauled lumber from Jefferson, which is on the border of Louisiana and Texas. He had 6 wagons, and he had blacksmith equipment and everything else. He come to Texas to stay.
And he said, I think the first thing in any town should be a church.
Well, that was the social activity. But church is what we did. So when my age children, girls and boys, moved to McKinney, they said, what is there to do? Well, we went to church. And they had never been to church that much in their lives. We had youth activities, we'd had youth trips, we had picnics.
The churches were here from the very beginning. One of the first things they did was, in any community, the men would get together and throw up a little log cabin for a school. The first one was 1848. Mr. Wilmoth built it, and he and his daughters taught it, 1848.
It was a small frame school, and best I remember, it only has like 2 windows on the sides. It was pretty small. But he also wrote the textbooks that they used to teach from.
In town proper, they had what they called subscription schools. Any teacher that wanted to teach would go around and get kids to sign up. Their parents would pay $2 for the term, and if he got enough students, then he would have a school.
Well, the Muse Academy was here too. I mean, it was established later. The building still stands on Wattle Street. It's a private home now.
They've always had good schools.
But we always had to do a lot more in school than anybody else did. I don't know any other students that have to memorize the first 24 lines of the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, but we had to. One thought of freely with his sure soda, the dread of March that pressed to the rhoda, and bothered every vein in swish liqueur, which for 2 engendered as the floor. One safer rucksack with his weight of...
They've had 150 years of experience in teaching kids. The teachers I had had been taught by probably the first generation of pioneer teachers, and they themselves were pioneer teachers.
Lungan folk to go on pilgrimages, and Palmers for the second Strawwain Strandes to Fernie Hallways, Couth and Sandria Landes, and especially from every Shires Enda, from Engeland to Canterbury, they went up, the Holy Blissful Martyr for the...
Well, we've always had to have a courthouse. The first one was a little 2-room log courthouse on the northwest corner of the square. And when they finished it in 1849, they had a big celebration, and what few people there were in the county were all there, and said they danced until midnight out on the street celebrating that courthouse. It's a hub of activity all through the years. The big one was not built until 1876. They had already voted to build it, and the Civil War came, and they just left the stones there and forgot it until after the war.
The Civil War had a tremendous impact on McKinney and Collin County.
When they were just about to enter the war, they had a meeting in Austin. All the counties were represented, and Collin County voted against entering the war.
Throckmorton was the leading political person in Collin County and McKinney in the 1860s, was strongly against secession. He's one of the very first people who takes the oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. He then comes back to Collin County and raises one of the very first units in Texas that was raised, the Confederate soldiers.
Every able-bodied man in the county had to march away, and were gone for 4 long years.
There are estimates that as much as 1/3 of the population went off to war, and that means that the women and the kids and the slaves were left to do the work.
People almost starved. They, with all the men gone, the women had to try to grow what food they could with the help of a few slaves.
There was a major fire in downtown McKinney that burned half the square. You couldn't get supplies because the blockade basically kept out anything. And even if you could get supplies, you probably couldn't afford it because Confederate money wasn't worth anything.
They said that want and misery just took over the whole county for 4 long years.
But the other thing that goes on here is that there are a huge number of people that are still very sympathetic to the Union.
They hid out in different places. There's a bunch of them hid out in what's now the Finch Park down there. It was just a thicket.
We really don't have any concept of how bad it was during the Civil War. It was really ugly. But you know, we survived that, and if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And I think it really made McKinney and North Texas a much stronger place. And when the railroads came to town in the 1870s, which you see is only 6, 7, 8 years after the Civil War, we're ready to take advantage of that, and we really do.
After the Civil War in 1872, the Houston and Texas Central Railroad, the first railroad in our region, was built north from Dallas to Denison and ultimately into Oklahoma.
This is a huge, major technological revolution in transportation in North Texas.
They said that up until 1872, when the railroad came, it was just a shabby little village, and very few people and stores scattered around the square.
For the very first time, you have cheap transportation into the heart of an agricultural area that has tremendous land.
At last, the farmers could ship their cotton, they could ship their grain, and before that, they'd have to have a big freight wagon, and that would take 6 weeks to go take it to market.
That opened up an enormous amount of markets for cash crops, as opposed to farming and doing crops specifically for your family. Now you could plant other crops that would bring money in, and you could actually sell them on foreign markets.
But it's not just stuff coming out, it's stuff coming in. Now you can open the Sears catalog and you can order.
The ladies especially were glad because they shipped in pretty dresses and things like the rest of the country was wearing, and they could lay their homespun things aside, and they felt real good, you know. That ushered in a new decade.
The architecture of downtown McKinney changes, the economics change, what people do changes. It becomes really a thriving economic center based on the railroads coming into town.
It was cotton and cotton and cotton.
Cotton was king. In fact, McKinney was known as cotton was king in this area.
There used to be 5 cotton gins in McKinney alone.
It was such a big event when the first bale of cotton came in. That would get a premium, and that would be taken down to the square and auctioned off at a very, very big price. So all 4 gins in McKinney wanted to gin the first bale of cotton.
And the farmers came in, they came into the middle of town, and when you look at the architecture in downtown McKinney, you'll see the 2nd-story floors with these big windows. Well, that's where the cotton brokers sat. And they'd shout out to the farmers and buy their cotton, and then the guys would take the cotton, dump it at the train station, then they'd come back and park their wagons outside the square because there wasn't a whole lot of room, and then they'd come back into town with their receipts and with their cotton brokers' paper, and then they'd go to the store and settle their account.
Cotton gins, like everything else then, were prone to fire. And the cottonseed house burned twice while he owned it. And then finally the gin burned, and I think that was the last of that. But one of the fun things that I remember, we lived right around the corner from the gin, and the great big old Victorian house there. And my neighbor just was so irritated during ginning season because the cotton gin ran all night and we didn't have air conditioners, so the windows were open and the noise was so irritating. My neighbor said, "I just wish that gin would burn." And sure enough, she felt so bad when it did. What I know that changed it was the boll weevil, a little black bug. Came all the way from Mexico, they say. Mr. Boll Weevil. And the boll weevils came, and that was a real disaster because the crops were not as good after that.
But the next really big innovation that comes in is the interurban, because what it meant was that you could jump on the train in the morning and you could be in Dallas in an hour or so, when before it took you all day to get to Dallas.
The interurban at this height went all the way from Waco to Denison, and it cost a quarter to ride from McKinney to Dallas, and a dime from any of the other stops along the way.
It was kind of like an expanded DART system.
I only rode the interurban once. I was about 4 years old, and my mother and my sister and I took the interurban to Dallas so that we could get to Union Terminal to take the train to meet my dad in Laredo.
And at that time, cars parked diagonally on the west side of the square. So if a car didn't pull in far enough, or if it were too long, the interurban could not get by. The tracks were not available. So the interurban would stand there and blow its whistle till the owners of the car came back and moved the car, and then it could continue.
What the interurban offered over the steam railroad is quick, clean, dependable transportation. And literally the interurban would stop at any farmer's driveway. He would walk out to the track and he could get on.
The last car ran in December 31st, 48, so it was 40 years here. And people just use that like we would a car today. I remember hearing ladies say, "Oh, there's a sale on hose down at Neiman Marcus, let's go." Get on the interurban, they'd go down there and get their hose back in time for lunch. I still wish we had it.
See, the interurban came through in 1908 And about 1911, as an adjunct to that, the Texas Electric Railway built the streetcar. It ran every 15 minutes or so from downtown, and it lasted until up into the 1920s.
Well, the first car that was seen in McKinney was 1903. He came across the square in 1903, and people had never seen a car, and everyone came out to watch it. He put it across the north side of the square, and when he got across, they all came out and looked down the dirt at the fancy little tire marks, you know, and they thought it was great. Well, then the banker, I've forgotten his name, bought one soon after that, and then everybody did.
And of course the interurban got done in by the next transportation revolution, which was the automobile. And they show up in McKinney like they did every place else in the country in the first decade of the 20th century. And before long, Collin County and McKinney and everybody else is worried about good roads, and as part of the good roads movement, and more cars are coming in and more horses are going out.
The tornado occurred in 1948 when the town turned as black as midnight.
So we could see that dark cloud, you know, in the west.
I was a senior in high school, and I had heard about tornadoes, but I had no idea what they were.
We had a perfect view of McKinney and the tornado, and I only got to see it when I was being herded to the storm cellar.
Well, we'd been noticing it was going to rain. It was looking dark, and we looked out the windows, and we'd never seen such dark clouds. Miss Susie was quite excited. The rest of us were pretty blasé about this. Hey, we were seniors, and what can touch us?
I took off at about 15 minutes or so before 3 o'clock to go down to the post office to get the mail. And when I left, it was cloudy, but it wasn't really bad. But when I left the post office, the clouds were boiling and rolling and just coming up and down like this right over the tops of the buildings.
It was the darkest, blackest thing I've ever seen. It was just black. And it was windy, but it was fun at that point.
And then we heard the roar, and it was, they say it's like a train. Well, it was like a dozen trains, you know, it was ferocious.
We could see the funnel dipping down, you know, and I suppose at the time that I saw it, the funnel, it was probably at the cotton mill.
And the first sound that we heard was someone running down the street yelling the school has been hit. And then someone came yelling that the mill has been hit. The saving grace down there was the fact that there were about 600 people who were involved in working there. And there were very few of them upstairs because it was the time for the change of shift. And those who worked upstairs had come downstairs, and those who were going to go upstairs to work had not gone yet.
You couldn't get through some roads because of the broken trees. One of my friends in high school, her whole second floor was blown off.
It was real devastating, but primarily to the south part of McKinney.
People was homeless, and you know, and the Red Cross helping them out, and the whole town turned out to help people, you know.
And there were many people who were very needy, and everything they owned had been blown away.
What happened at that point was my first evidence of really how civic-minded and caring McKinney was.
They gave them everything. Because, I mean, there was people that were completely wiped out.
That the schools and the people were ready to join in to help anybody who needed help.
When I first came, McKinney Square was just a little world in itself. You could do everything in the world that your family needed in one trip. You could buy your groceries, buy your clothes, conduct a funeral, go to church, go to the dentist. Everything was right there.
People came to town on Saturday and walked around and around the square, and they bought the groceries and left them at the store, and when they got ready to leave that night, they'd pick them up. Go home.
My grandmother and her two sisters would usually come into town on Saturday and would just walk around the square and walk around the square and walk around the square.
This downtown used to be country town, you know, just like all country towns. And the square here was the focus.
It was a very social place at that time.
The Confederate reunions were held every year in J. Crumb's yard. And every year they would take a picture, and they were all lined up, and they just had a fine time every year, reminiscing and all of that.
Well, when I was a little kid, of course, Saturday morning was a big deal. We had two theaters, and both of those showed serials on Saturday morning.
I could get in for 9 cents and I'd make 3 movies.
Some of my next door neighbors, one of them was a high school girl, and she would ask me to go with her sometime with her boyfriend out to the first airport there was out west of town, where airplanes would come in and they'd give flying lessons and they'd sell hamburgers. And so I would, you know, that's when I was introduced to a small plane.
Well, we had what they called department stores then. J.C. Penney was a great big 2-story building. They took up both floors. And Perkins Brothers and Cobb's Shoe Store, they're just all kinds of businesses.
Because at that time on the square, almost all the businesses stayed open until the customers stopped coming in.
That was McKinney for you.
Most towns grew up around a river or some old settler's place or something, but McKinney was all planned out.
I think there are so many opportunities yet still in McKinney and in Collin County.
I came to realize this was a wonderful place to grow up. It was not what high school people always say it is. I'm never coming back if I ever get out. It was the kind of place that many people have come back to, and I have loved being back here and getting reacquainted with the town that I grew up in.
We've had a lot of fun, haven't we? And people did. Everybody was, or I say everybody, it was a very congenial bunch.
There's nothing economically that would have driven people out of McKinney. As a matter of fact, it's just the opposite. The economics and the growth here is drawing people to McKinney. So,
The best thing in McKinney, the people. I just think that my husband was right when he said McKinney was settled by fine old pioneers and their genes still run in the blood of their descendants.
You know, one thing I liked about McKinney back then, whenever I was a kid, well, you could just walk anywhere, go anywhere. You didn't have to worry about anything, you know. It was just a nice place to live.
we see a transportation revolution, which is a horrible cliche now, but it really was, and it really and truly did change everything. And as a matter of fact, we're probably on the cusp of another one, because we now have an airport in McKinney, and it's not going to get any smaller, I can guarantee you that.
I have seen it come from a one-horse town to a two-horse town. And when they get enough horses to pull a wagon train, well, it'll be the center of north central